Alright, so I recently finished up Yakuza 4, and honestly, I don't know exactly how to feel. It's a good game, as expected from the series, but it's in kind of an odd place, I feel like, in the grand scheme of the franchise now. Because if you go in chronological order, like I feel like a lot of people might, Yakuza 0 is the cream of the crop, the gold standard. Kiwami felt like an expansion or a lighter, more bite-sized version of Zero, since it kind of wound up being about half the length. And where I had, a few minor complaints about Kiwami 2 and 3, I felt like 2 being on a completely different engine and 3 being so early on with the older engine, they both still felt like they stood out. And I feel like 4 just didn't hit as hard as usual. At the time, it was probably a big step forward for the series, but now it feels like a step back from what we had in Zero and Kiwami, but it's not as far off as 3 was. And I just sort of wonder, when I eventually in several years finally catch up on the series, if this is going to be one of the more forgettable entries, since it's far enough from the gold standard to be noticeable when you play it, but it's not far enough to really stand out in its own right, if that makes any sense. But yeah, for the time, I mean, if you started with the original 1 and 2 and not the Kiwamis and didn't have 0, I feel like it's really huge to have brought in 3 new protagonists, all with their own gameplay style, to freshen things up. Although, playing some of the more updated releases kind of had me missing Style Swap, which I know only really existed in 0 and Kiwami, although I think they may have brought it back in the guidance. I'm not gonna lie, I'm really tempted for when I get to Yakuza 6. I did see there is a mod that brings it back in the new engine of trying it out, because I just really liked it. And it was like completely absent from 2 and 3, but here you get a little bit of a taste with, the different styles they have here, and how one of Seijima's styles reminded me of, the Kiryu heavy style. Although I don't remember, because Saejima has a mechanic where he can kind of charge up and take some more minor hits while he does. I don't remember if that was a thing in Kiryu's heavy style. But it was, appreciated mechanic, as was Tanmura's counter system. Unfortunately, Akiyama didn't really get an interesting mechanic, and Kiryu stayed the same, but Akiyama primarily fights with his feet, which kind of gave him a bit of a different feel, honestly. Even if it was primarily, just animations and heat actions and stuff. Although they did all feel kind of unique in that regard, with Saejima being a powerhouse and Tanmura being counter-focused. But like I said, all other 3 protagonists were more on the hand-to-hand side. But Akiyama is still, enough to stand out on his own right in terms of gameplay. And maybe they just didn't want to introduce mechanics until a little later on, since the game starts with him, and if they were already set on not starting with Kiryu either, might be a lot to take in, a new mechanic and a new initial protagonist here. Unlike the previous 2 games, you are exclusively in Kamurocho, but I'm not gonna lie, I'm really starting to appreciate the setting. Like, I feel like this is about the time I've sort of started to have the realization that I know this open world better than my actual neighborhood in real life. starting to get to the point where they can kind of just say where I need to go, and I'm not really looking so much at the mini map anymore. And like I said, you start to appreciate even more just sort of the evolution, especially in this game. I already did get to see the Chinatown-ish area in Zero, and I think some of the underground stuff was in Kiwami 2, I want to say. But I think this is the first time we've seen the rooftops or the parking lots and sewers of the underground section. I think it may have just been the mall and some of like the hallways before. So I can still appreciate the approach. I think it's a solid direction. Although it did kind of throw me off because I knew 5 kind of has a different location for each protagonist or something. Or at least I know there's 5 locations, like there's 5 different protagonists, so I kind of thought that was going to happen here too. Like I said, though, not really a big deal that they didn't, especially when they do a decent job too of unlocking more areas as you progress, because they sort of lock out certain areas based on criteria, the later playable characters later meet. As for other gameplay stuff, you saw a chase scene there earlier. I do like how they added throwable items, but I kind of wish it was a little more balanced with what it was last time. Because I don't know, I feel like if you get a good throw in, that can be kind of it, or you can sort of rely on just throwing. I wish maybe you took out, I don't know, more substantial damage by actually getting them with a melee dash. Or maybe if you caught up to them quicker, so you can kind of have a more balance back and forth between the two. With sub games, there wasn't really too crazy of one this time around. Fighter Maker is probably the biggest thing, and it was okay. I went through all of it. It was serviceable, although not as engaging or as in-depth or gameplay shaking as some of, Zero and the remakes. But I at least did it this time. I didn't do the Hostess Maker in 3, which is back this time around, but that was just a little too slow and complicated to be particularly interesting to me to sort of learn and master. So yeah, basically kind of a step up in that perspective. Speaking of the hostesses, though, this is the first time, although I don't really know how it was structured when you also had the cabaret minigame, if there was still a separate thing to visit the hostesses, but I never really bothered with it until this game, mainly because you're kind of forced to in one of the side stories. But then by the time I beat it, I was invested and was curious how they ended things or what, differences there are between each of them. And I thought I only had to visit all of them, another 2 times, right? Yeah, but I kind of regretted it because, I don't know, kind of in the heat of it, just kind of got tedious. But like I said, I was kind of into had the sunk cost fallacy and went through it all. So I probably wouldn't do that again unless it's a little more streamlined or something. But kind of reminds me of the last game, because the last game was the first time I made any sort of effort to clear the restaurant completion. And I didn't do it again in this one, but I did the hostess thing instead. So I don't know what other compilation thing I normally avoid I'm going to wind up attempting in a future game. Golf was a little disappointing this time. I think I made a particular note of it last time because I thought it was actually kind of good. It was kind of forgiving and a little addictive. Unfortunately, it was kind of revamped this time, and it was kind of more what I expected the first time, honestly. So yeah, I did play through it once. Finished second to last out of the tournament of 8 or whatever, and then I was just kind of done with it, like I normally would have been. I did want to make note of the claw machine too, because I don't remember if there was a side story in 3, but I did notice there wasn't one that forced you to interact with it in this game, because that was something that I would normally roll my eyes at, because I just really suck at it. It winds up being, not a good time. Although I still wound up messing with it just because it looked like it was a little different than I was used to. I feel like it was. Like, the one in particular seemed kind of easy because all of the prizes you can get were sort of on this slope. And one of the machines didn't even seem to have like a big wall over it. So I figured it might actually be easier, which, yeah, it was. Like I said, I don't remember there being a slope. I remember it being more of a straightforward, flat area that you had to try to, grab something and have a good enough grip to get it to the edge. I'm going to give a spoiler alert right now if you're, playing through the series and don't want to know about the story in this one, because it's time to talk about it. Rubber bullets, that seems to be the big topic regarding this game. And controversial, I feel like, twist. Honestly, when they initially sort of did that whole thing, it didn't sit well with me. Like, I don't know, it seemed a little too out there, and it didn't really sit and, process in my head. But after, sitting on it and playing through a bit more of the game, I was able to sort of justify the decision and logic with it in my head. So, I don't know, at this point, it is what it is. An interesting choice I don't feel particularly strong about. I do sort of wonder with that whole thing, though. Like, what if you got shot in the face? Would that still kill you, or would it have been obvious to Saejima that he didn't kill anyone? And then the money thing at the end, too, with Akiyama. I thought if anyone, they would have done that to Tamura, just because, I mean, kind of a spoiler, but I already know he's the one protagonist who doesn't come back in the next game as playable. So I was wondering if something like that would happen, or if he just wasn't particularly interesting or fun to play as, and all of that wound up being false. But yeah, the whole thing with the money stopped the bullet, and I think they said it was a real bullet this time and not another rubber one. Although a rubber one would have been a bit more logical, and at that point, it would have almost felt fitting in a way. But I did Google it, and it did say that you would need a ridiculous amount of money to block a bullet. So that's the thing that's not sitting as well with me. Just sort of suspending the disbelief there. Not that the game's, super realistic in, other regards either, but that was for some reason something that sort of crossed my mind and line. Like, I just don't think it would work like that, and like I said, according to Google, it wouldn't. So maybe sort of the rubber bullet deal was sort of what drew more attention to that detail, even. The one twist I did like, though, was the Keto twist, because I thought they were sort of having him in sort of a Rikia type role. But then when they sort of come out and they're like, yeah, he's playing a bit deeper of a role in the grand scheme of things. And oh yeah, he is, kind of a competent fighter too, despite him not appearing to be as much so earlier on in the story. I did like that. They got me on that one. My only complaint with that is they didn't give him a back tattoo, because I think I've stated this before, but I do like just, looking into the back tattoos they have in this series, and just sort of, the artwork and symbolism behind them. I just think it's kind of cool. And I feel like there was a missed opportunity there for something. That, and maybe, because you have a couple characters kind of going back and forth between the police and the Yakuza, so I don't know if either of them could have had one too. That would have been interesting. The thing that I think is going to stand out most about this game down the line is how well it connected all of the previous games, I felt like. Like, it continued plot lines from 3, it connected them to the events that happened in 1. And I feel like there was similar vibes with 2, with both having an organization being seemingly taken out or severely weakened, sort of operating in the background, rebuilding themselves up for this story in a big role, although a little lesser of a role. That became a bit less of a plot line later on, but in this game, I guess maybe you could say that in 2 as well, but it was a bit deeper on in 2. Actually, no, now that I'm thinking about it, that's kind of a stretch. I don't think you can really say that about 2, but you can't say it about this one. Kind of remembering things with the finale on that one, but another thing I did appreciate too was, like 3, 4 does try to have multiple antagonists, and I just feel like it does a much better job at it. Like 3 just kind of felt like everyone kind of had their arc to be the main bad guy, where here there's a lot of back and forth and it kind of keeps you on your toes and more invested with it. I will say, though, I am kind of missing the kind of more direct, overarching rival like we had with Nishiki and Ryuji. I don't know how well you could have really written a character like that into the last 2 games, or even, how easy it is to land on a character like Kuze from Yakuza 0, where, yeah, there was multiple villains kind of going back and forth in that, but you still had someone just really stand out, I guess, with just how well they're incorporated into everything and how interesting they are. Overall, though, this was still definitely a great game overall. Like I said, I just sort of wonder, like, it's still a good Yakuza game, because, it plays like a Yakuza game. It's what you would expect, because I know normally when you say it may not be the greatest Yakuza game, that's kind of the direction that kind of takes more often. But like I said, when you compare it to everything else the series has to offer, I just wonder if it's going to be on the weaker end. Still definitely looking forward to 5. Like I said, if they took this much of a step towards the peak of 0 and Kiwami, I can imagine 5 being pretty damn close. I think it's the game right before 2. I did hear some people kind of complain that there's just almost too much content, and some of it just isn't as fine-tuned as you would ideally want, but I want to make that judgment for myself when we eventually get there. Although, as per usual, I'm going to take a little bit of a break, play a couple other games in between entries. So definitely looking forward to it. And I'm sure as we get closer to 5 and, have that little more of an itch to play through one of these, big games after, not having it for a little while, it's going to be a good time when we eventually get there.